This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
I remember one time he was like, I think your situation is harder. He's like, I think you have the harder job.
As a caregiver for him?
Yeah. And like picturing me as a grieving person, I think. And I was like, that's false. I was like, nope, I don't think that's true.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Dr. Lucy Kalanithi is my guest today to talk about life, loss, grief, and how she's still writing the epilogue to her husband's book, When Breath Becomes Air. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode of The Heart of Hospice is sponsored by Odonata Care. When caring for a loved one on hospice, support becomes essential. Introducing the Care Plan, a path to comfort for the hospice patient, a supportive guide by experienced hospice nurses Nancy Hireman and Brenda Kazire. Nancy and Brenda invite you to experience all that the Care Plan has to offer. Be sure to check out their free library of care videos on thecareplan.net or on YouTube. Purchase your copy of the Care Plan today at thecareplan.net.
My guest today is fantastic. And I have to say, this may be, out of all 89 episodes that have ever been recorded, this might be my favorite one. It was awesome. So Dr. Lucy Kalanithi is a clinical associate professor of medicine at Stanford University. She is an advocate for patient-centered care. She's also the widow of Dr. Paul Kalanithi, author of the #1 New York Times best-selling memoir, When Breath Becomes Air, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and translated into more than 40 languages, and for which she wrote the epilogue. Lucy has served on leadership boards for TEDMED, the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care, and the American College of Physicians. Her award-winning podcast, Gravity, explores narratives of suffering. So we are talking about all the stuff today. Grief, loss, suffering, the conversations around grief, and what it was like for her to be her partner's husband was when he was experienced such a serious illness. She's going to be telling her story about their relationship and what occurred with Paul's health and how it shaped her career and her life going forward since his death. She talks with me about her perception of the current healthcare systems that we have here in the U.S. and how she sees herself as a clinician and how she views her patients as well. And she's going to be talking about how she wrote the epilogue to the book, how that came to fruition and what that process was like for her. So here's my conversation with Dr. Lucy Kalanithi. Lucy, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am thrilled to have you. You are a dream guest that I've been chasing for several years, so I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. And to get to know you a little bit better, I have an icebreaker question that I did not send you in advance.
Cool.
Yes. So here's the question so my listeners and I can get to know you a little bit better. When you're in a bad mood, who is your go-to person to make it instantly better?
Oh, my sister. So I have a twin sister who's 2 minutes older than me. the vibe is actually that she's the oldest. It's three siblings, and she's the oldest. I'm the middle by 2 minutes, but that's the whole vibe in our family for years and years. I'm the peacemaker, and she's the like, make the trains run. She lives in Brooklyn. She's a writer. She actually has a blog called Cup of Joe that's like out in the world, and it's just very different from me. And also we know each other infinitely well. So it's always her.
Very cool. But I have to ask you, so if you're the middle child, I'm the youngest of three. My brother is the problem middle child.
Ooh, interesting.
Yes. So
Ooh.
middle children get a bad rap, although I have to say a lot of times it's justified.
That's funny.
Knowing my brother, yeah, he is the quintessential middle problem child. But
Yeah, interesting.
when you guys were little, did you have special ways of communicating for just the two of you?
Yes, we did actually. We had like a language when we were toddlers. My parents tell us. And then now everyone's like, oh, like if Joanna sprains her ankle, do you know it immediately? And it's like, no, but I think about her all the time, and I get worried about her like more than I get worried about other people and stuff like that.
It's just a deeper connection, sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to jump into more about you because I want to hear your story. Tell me the story of you and Paul and how his book, or your book with Paul, When Breath Becomes Air, came into being.
Yeah. So Paul Kalanithi was my late husband. He died about 8 years ago. And the two of us met in medical school as first-year students. And then by our fourth year, we were married. And we moved to California to start our residencies. I became an internist, and he became a neurosurgeon. He was a really interesting, beautiful, funny person. And he initially had thought he would be an English professor. So it's like a real jump to neurosurgery, but he was just really interested in the mind and the brain and identity and suffering and life and death. And so to him, they were sort of a piece. And he was on his way to becoming a really good surgeon, and then started to become sick, actually, when he was a senior resident in neurosurgery at Stanford. And I was like beginning my career as an internist. And over the course of about 6 months, maybe last week, came to realize that he had stage 4 lung cancer and a prognosis of like probably months to a few years. Initially, we thought it was weeks, and then it sort of stretched out into this other uncertain future. And he lived for 22 months with that illness. He died when he was 37. And during that time, he went back to work initially as a surgeon, and then started writing as a personal reflection, but then some published pieces, and then began working on this manuscript in earnest for a memoir about being a doctor and a patient and thinking about those same issues. And we decided to have a baby during the time that he was sick as well, which is a big decision. And then ultimately the book came out after he died. And the publisher asked me to do a book tour, which sounded bananas. And also, like, as I'm sure a lot of people relate to, like, in a way, initially right after he died, like, I only felt like myself when I was working on the book, like with and for Paul, if that makes sense. And so then I like worked on the manuscript and the copy editing and the cover and the publicity and the book tour, and sort of carried that forward. And then in my own career, sorry, this is like such a long answer. In my own career as a physician, I've always been interested in patients with serious illness and their families, and like healthcare costs, especially monetary costs. Like, what things do we spend too much money on? What things do we not spend enough money on? And just like wellness writ large and meaning, and ultimately sort of the chance to like tell our family stories in a different way from Paul, but sort of similarly has like shaped me as a doctor and even shaped my academic career. And I've sort of moved into thinking about like stories and storytelling, and less so like policy and like implementation in the healthcare setting. So it's just weird. It's like life just never turns out to be what you thought it was going to be. And it can also be beautiful and wonderful.
There's so much I want to unpack, but what I hear you saying when you talk about you've gone from a focus on regulation and policy to a focus on the art of providing care, medical care for someone. That's such a reflection of who Paul was and how he began to write, because in the book, which is hilariously well written, when most physicians cannot even write legibly.
I think he was a writer who became a doctor instead of the other.
Absolutely. He had a degree in English literature.
Yeah.
Yes, it absolutely shows through in his book. So it doesn't read like you're reading orders, that are written out in the hospital. I remember reading the book and being struck by that. But he had such a recognition of the blend of the humanity and the science and how we are providing care in an industry, in the healthcare industry. And I remember reading about how grueling it was to be a neurosurgeon.
Yeah, he writes about how he got really burned out and kind of lost it.
Yeah.
And then do that and was just like, yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he writes about what it was like to be a patient and how, obviously we had like layers on layers of privilege that made it easier. And it was still the hardest thing. And it was hard to be a patient and be, sort of dehumanized in a way, which is really hard.
It is. But I think it gained perspective for him that really anybody who works in healthcare needs.
Totally.
Right? I've been a patient and I've gone in there and I'm like, these people suck. I can't believe that. Yeah. And then I realized, well, I've probably done this to somebody.
Right.
I can do better.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, you just have to hold it all at the same time. It's like, I think of like a pilot in a cockpit, right? And they're like, I got to fly this plane perfectly. And we have to get where we're going. And they're not like, who's going to a wedding? Who's going to a funeral? Like, who are my passengers? But it's like both. You have to keep toggling like all the time, and yeah, totally.
Yeah. We're not he's not flying boxes around. He's got people on the airplane. And I think sometimes we, as healthcare providers, no matter what your discipline is, we like to objectify people because it's a little easier to shuffle them around. For instance, when we help someone find an alternate place to live, we say we place them somewhere.
Oh, so interesting. Gosh, no kidding.
That's objectifying.
Yeah, that's bananas. Yeah.
You take a mug and you set it in the cabinet. You place it in the cabinet.
Oy.
Those are for objects, not human beings.
Yeah. Or there's this other thing that's like, I always think about how people will say like empowering a patient or like involving the patient in the plan of care. And it's like, it is not like the patient is the plan of care. Their life is the plan of care. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, we are lucky to be involved. And that it's really interesting, right? There is so much that's centered. Like you say, the language is even centered.
And I think sometimes we pay lip service to things like that. The plan of care is all about the patient. Sometimes that's just crap.
Sure.
That's not true because A, we don't want to pay for it. B, we don't have time for it. C, your insurance won't cover it.
Right. But then it's like, there's all these people who entered as clinicians, right? With these like very deeply felt ideals. Like there's a lot of easier jobs you could do. And so I feel like it can be equally distressing for clinicians who feel it.
Yes, there's moral distress. Sure.
Totally. Yeah. I think that phrase is right.
So I think being a patient, the way Paul was, gives perspective to somebody who's providing that care. So you know what it's like to be on the other side. And what I hope is that for those of us who have experienced any type of illness or surgery or any sort of health scare, that it really makes us look at things differently and understand where our patients are coming from.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
I just went through like a mini health scare. And after seeing like a few clinicians, I was like, you know what I just want? I want someone to say 2 sentences. I want someone to say, I hear you saying this is affecting your life every single day. I will stick with you until we have it figured out. I was like, please, can someone say this to me? And now that's something I've always thought about with patients, but now I'm just like, it comes out of my mouth. I'm like, what do I wish I had heard, Totally.
And that's not complicated. It's not medical jargon.
It's not.
No, it's people jargon. It's just talking to somebody.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's good. Like you were saying that thing about like, sorry, I don't mean to get you in the weeds on this like thing, but it's really interesting. You were talking about like, oh yeah, and then we're using this language, and is it fake? I also think there is a good side to like having structured language if it's the right language, because like just because you have good intentions isn't like you suddenly become a good clinician or a deft clinician in what you say, right? There is like a fake it till you make it aspect of like learning
Right.
communication skills anyway, but this is all swirling around all the time.
So if we're talking about standardized language, right, that really helps, right? Because then everybody's speaking the same thing. We all understand what everybody's doing. But what if standardized language also included the 2 sentences that you wanted somebody to ask you?
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah,
What if
right.
what if that was standardized language along
Right.
with saying plan of care and person-centered care?
Right.
Yeah. If that kind of communication became
Yeah,
standardized,
right. Right.
I like it.
Which basically is like see you as a real person.
Yes. Instead of a patient. I think the
Mm-hmm.
labels help us to move people within the systems that we have. We have an industry. Well, I don't want to get care from an industry.
Yeah,
I want to get
right.
care from my doctor, from my
Right.
nurse practitioner.
Right.
And don't get me started on AI.
Mm. It could be helpful. It could be helpful.
It can be helpful. I get that. But it just goes against my grain because I firmly believe that technology should never take the place of touch. And during the pandemic, hospice professionals and patients and their caregivers really suffered from that lack of connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was so detrimental for a lot of professionals that work in end of life care. It was hard for us not to do
Like
that.
actually traumatizing, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely was. I think, we talked a lot about older people, especially in long-term care facilities, becoming isolated. I think that the providers that worked in end-of-life care became isolated as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Totally.
we had to turn the faucet off, all this empathic care, that we like to provide, and we had nowhere for it to go.
Right, totally.
So let's touch back on the book for just a minute.
Yeah.
So after Paul's death, the publisher wanted you to write the epilogue.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe that experience? You said it made it feel like you were with Paul.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just like start there. I mean, I knew that Paul was going to die. I knew it the whole time. Didn't know when, but I knew it. And then when he was dying, I knew it. And the last day was confusing because you just never know it's the last day until it's really definitely the last day. But the moment he died, and then like the day after he died, et cetera, was like so weirdly shocking, even though I knew it. It was like what it felt like to me was like he was here and then he disappeared. Like he just disappeared.
Yeah.
And like somehow I just hadn't been ready for like that feeling. And during his illness, and obviously like during a marriage, you are so intertwined, and like especially during the intensity of an illness like that, like you sort of become fused, right? Like I remember we would go see the oncologist and she would say stuff like, how's the new pain medicine working for you guys? And it's like I wasn't the one taking it, but I was the one, like I was in it. I was like in it, and as much as someone ever could be. And so yeah, to have him disappear was just like utterly existentially shocking. And so then it just felt, it really felt like a connection to keep this thing going that he had wanted to finish. And initially when they said, do you want to write the epilogue? I was like, what? And then I sort of realized like, well, if Paul could have told the story of like how he died, that actually he like would have, like that was like part of his story.
Right.
So that felt like it deserved to be told. And then the epilogue like talks about that day and then talks about like reflecting on him and like even where he's buried, and then what's a little bit of what was happening after that in those months. And so Yeah. And so, but I'm not a writer. I'm more of a talker. And so I initially said, well, can I have a ghostwriter? And so they matched me up with this woman. She's so amazing. Her name's Emily Rapp Black, and she's a memoirist. And she had a child who died of Tay-Sachs, and she also has a limb difference and has a prosthesis for one of her legs. And she's like very interested in like mortality and embodiment and just like big questions. And she's like incredibly lyrical, and she's incredibly profane. Like she's like swearing all the time when you're actually with her in person. She's like the perfect grief buddy. And so she actually flew in like with her young child, and I had me and Katie, and we spent like 2 days together, just like going through pictures of Paul, talking about Paul. And ultimately she sort of like coached me through the epilogue. I really needed help with the structure. She sort of gave me tips. Like one point she was like, okay, if you're describing the day that Paul died, like where was the light coming from in the room? And like what kind of chairs were you sitting in? And so I ended up saying like we were in these vinyl chairs that like our patients had sat in. And she was like, the more sensory detail you can give, the more visceral it is to the reader. And so weirdly, like the more specific you can get, the more universal it ends up feeling. It was really cool writing advice.
Interesting.
And yeah. And so she helped me with that. And, but like when I look back at the drafts, I was like, oh yeah, like I wrote this, but then like some of it is hers, and the structure was like came through her. And so it was like she ends up calling herself a collaborator. But that was a fantastic process. It just felt compelling to me and like good. And then obviously I was really proud of Paul. And so I want to do a good job.
So did you and Paul ever talk about you writing the epilogue to the book?
No. We thought he was trying to finish it. He was trying to finish it, and then it was unfinished.
Yeah.
But we didn't, I mean, we could have been like, after I die, can you write this? But it's like, there was also a chance that he was going to finish it and it would come out when he was alive, you know?
Mm-hmm.
He just didn't know.
Yeah. It's interesting. So why do you think the book resonated so deeply with people when it came out in 2016? Because it's wildly popular.
Yeah. It was like on the New York Times list for a year.
Yeah. And I think it's been published, in 30 or 40 different languages?
Yeah. And people want to make a movie of it, which but I don't think will happen unless Katie does it as an adult. It's interesting. I mean, it just like hit the zeitgeist in a certain way. And like, Donald Trump got elected. Was it later that year, 2016? And just like if it had come in a different time, I think it like wouldn't have, because some of it is just like timing and luck and what's happening culturally and how people feel. Sure. But I think like one thing that's interesting, I was talking to Paul's agent before it came out, his literary agent. And I was like, how do you think it's going to do? And she was like, it's so unpredictable. It's like, it's a book essentially about dying by a person who just died. And so like either it's going to do terribly or like really well. And I was like, cool. And I understand. Like, I was asking you, but I don't know. I think it's sort of like, I think it just hit something. I'll say it a couple different ways. It's about meaning, which everyone is like interested in at some level. It's really beautifully written. So that's like, obviously makes you want to read it. I think a lot of people read it and then gave it to someone else, like to think about and talk about. And then I also feel like it's like at this weird cultural moment where sort of like, at least in like, there's a weird cultural moment where it's like the first time in history where like death and dying and suffering and aging are kind of like hidden, like not done in the same like ways that they have been done in the past or are being done around the world. But I think for people for whom that's true, like engaging with these questions is appealing. It's like people still want to. I think people sought it out as like, these are important questions that I'm interested in.
When caring for a loved one on hospice, support becomes essential. Introducing the Care Plan, a path to comfort for the hospice patient, a supportive guide by experienced hospice nurses Nancy Hireman and Brenda Kazire, with over 40 years of combined hospice experience. The Care Plan is your trusted companion, a wealth of knowledge from clinicians who understand the unique challenges of hospice care. Nancy and Brenda provide practical insights in their book, along with a library of guided videos that offer caregiving tips and techniques to make caregiving easier and simpler. The Care Plan isn't just a book, it's a source of strength for those who navigate the challenges of caregiving, ensuring that every moment is embraced with compassion and care. The goal of Odonata Care is to transform the end-of-life experience through education and support. Nancy and Brenda invite you to experience all that the Care Plan has to offer. Be sure to check out their free library of care videos on thecareplan.net or on YouTube. Don't forget that the Care Plan is also available in Spanish. Purchase your copy of the Care Plan today at thecareplan.net.
So, do you think it resonates differently now after the pandemic? Because the grief conversation, even globally, but across the United States, is different. We are global grievers now in a way that we weren't before. Do you think the book sits
right?
differently? Yeah, I hope that was a good lesson of the pandemic. So do you think the book sits differently now with people?
I still hear from a lot of people, and I hear from people like on an individual level, like I lost someone, this was really helpful. Like I still get that a lot from people and hear that. I don't really know. I think such a good question. I mean, I think if you're suffering very deeply, like in the moment, it can sometimes be like white hot to read a book like that, because you're just like, I'm trying to just make it through and I can't engage with.
Yeah, it's too much.
It's too much. And so there's a chance that like that is the case. So I don't know. I think in a way it like receded a bit during the pandemic, partly for that reason, but I don't know for sure. I don't know. What do you think for a book like that?
I think that makes sense. I think the grief for us became tangible, not from losing people, but just loss in general. Loss of safety, security, sense of self, all sorts of things. Safety out in the community, security inside our own bodies, being bombarded by a virus that we'd never had.
Yeah.
Maybe too tender a pain point.
Yeah. Depending on what's happening like globally and politically, I also think it's like there's different kinds of suffering, right? So like this book is about how to make sense of like the suffering that can come to anyone. It's like bodily suffering, right? Like, how do I make sense of the fact that someday I will die?
Right.
But then there's another type of suffering, which is just like unjust suffering, like suffering that actually like is unfair, like in a true sense. Just compared to like lightning strikes your body randomly. And so I actually think like in a way, there's a different moral question when it comes to like injustice. And so I think a lot of people are going down that road also, with like wars that are happening and like leadership that's betraying us and, just like racism and all different kinds of injustice. And so this book is like related to that, but it's actually not the same questions. So I think there's a place for it, but I don't think it's the only type of suffering to understand. Or some suffering, it's like you should fight. Other suffering you should accept. Should is a strong word, but
no, but that's an interesting point. There are lessons to be learned through all
just
of it.
like, yeah. Like, and how do you choose? Like, how do you choose which type of suffering to like tolerate and soften to,
Right.
and which type of suffering not to? Actually, do you know Adi Barkan, who has ALS, who's like a young like activist? So his name's Adi Barkan, and this is like a young man. He's younger than me. He was in his early 30s when he was diagnosed with ALS. And he's now like very disabled and like one of the world's most powerful activists, and he uses like eye gaze technology to do a ton of like social media activism. And he's incredibly just like a brilliant mind and a brilliant leader. Yeah, he wrote this article in The Nation, and I just would highly recommend this to people. The title is "I'm Dying. Here is what I refuse to accept with serenity." And he actually talks directly about this tension between how do you choose what to accept and what to fight in your life. And he takes the serenity prayer and then like reorders it and flips it around in a way that makes more sense to him. It's really beautiful. You should read it.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out. I think Paul had a lot of those questions, and from what I remember from reading the book, he forged ahead. Even when he was undergoing treatment, he didn't stay away from his work for very long.
Yeah, that was like his personality. But I think, yeah, that was his, like, there's a lot of ways to handle like a serious cancer diagnosis, right? Like if your job isn't a good fit for you, leave it forever.
Sure.
So like everyone's different, but, right. Some people leave their marriage when that happens.
But Paul was gifted as a surgeon. He was, he was an up and comer.
That was part of what made his life meaningful and what was really important to him in terms of meaning. And so he didn't want to leave it aside. And interestingly, at the same time, like he got diagnosed and then he was like, I have to like resurrect my same life. I have to keep going. And then as he was going along, he was like, actually, this is a different life. I have a different life now. So like writing seeped into that and just changing. He realized he wasn't going to have a 40-year career as a neurosurgeon, and then did have to like change his relationship to that work.
Did he recognize the book as a legacy project? Did he see it that way?
Yeah.
Because that's what it is.
Yeah. And he like really recognized it as something that he was leaving for our daughter, as a way to know him.
Wonderful. On your Twitter account, you have, your name and everything on there. And you write, still writing epilogue to When Breath Becomes Air. So that's, it's been 8 years. What does that mean for you, still writing the epilogue?
Yeah, that just like popped out. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, it just means like, we're still that story, or we're still connected to Paul, and I guess what I kind of mean is like, I guess like one piece of it, although I didn't really think this through, is like when breath becomes air is when breath becomes air, but when breath becomes air is also like real Paul and like Paul's real life. And like, similarly, like we're still writing the epilogue to like Paul and our family.
Yeah. Well, Paul's life was your life.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. You were talking about how a married couple like that, especially when you go through something so significant, you're intertwined. So you're just carrying the story forward.
Yeah. Totally.
Is the way I see it. So do you ever reread the book? Do you ever go back and dip a toe in and read?
Yeah. Yes, actually. So like just kind of randomly sometimes. I sort of have it memorized, to be honest. I've just like read it so many times, and then just being way in the weeds on editing initially, I just like, I know every single word. Mm-hmm. If someone says a sentence, I'll like can say the sentence after. So, yeah, I just know it really well. But then I am interested. Sometimes I think about like, okay, when it's my turn and I'm really sick, that might not be what happens to me, but it might be. And like, if I read it then, and it's different, like if I see more in it than I ever have, that will actually make me sad. Yeah, I don't know.
But you would see it from a different perspective.
That'll make me sad because I'll be like, what did I miss when Paul was here? Or maybe I'll be like, I understood every single thing.
That's a hard one though. You want to of course think, oh, I was right there for every step, everything. But of course your emotions, your perceptions of it, your experience of the illness couldn't have been the same.
Totally. And
Yeah.
and like Paul loved this poem that he like brought me in med school. And there was a line that was like circles touching at edges or circles touching at a point. And it basically is like, you can never be part of someone's like internal self. And like you try your best and you overlap and stuff, you
Yeah.
know? I remember one time he was like, I think your situation is harder. He's like, I think you have the harder job.
As a caregiver for him.
Yeah. Yeah. And like picturing me as a grieving person, I think. And I was like, that's false. I was like, nope, I don't think that's true.
Wow. I get where he was going with it, because with his death, his suffering was ended.
Yeah.
But yours, you lived forward with yours.
Yeah. I mean, I think he certainly thought his mom had a harder job.
It's interesting that he could see that far outside of himself at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
With such significant illness. So when you think about how people handle grief, obviously, hopefully, we've changed in that over the last 4 or 5 years. Do you think society has evolved in how we handle grief, how we talk about it, and how we support each other in grief?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it depends like what you mean by society, right? Because there's also like a million microcultures and like
Sure.
some cultures are beautifully great at this. But there is this weird, like, it is hard to know what to say. I mean, when I have had friends who lost somebody, I am still Googling like what to write in a condolence letter,
Are you serious?
Totally. What do you put on the card? And it's like, I think it's just like, it's hard. It's just hard. You want to be able to say something that is helpful, and it's like impossible it's like so many times you cannot help, no matter what. And so like, basically it's like, I've learned to just be like, I wish I knew what to say. I wish this wasn't happening. I love you. I'm here with you. It's hard, I kind of do think there's a shift. I don't know if this is coming from like whatever the name of the generation is that's currently like 24.
Yeah, whatever they are. Yeah.
If you just think about like stigma around mental illness, or like people talking about their abortions, or I do think it feels to me like there's a cultural movement of like really trying to reduce stigma, and really trying to like help people be authentic, or like, here's my experience as a neuroatypical person, like just like truly necessary movement to be like, how do we support each other even as we're all different?
I think so too. I think there's a building conversation that's happening. And sometimes I think it's because I work in hospice and end-of-life care, and I'm connected with all these people that deal in grief, or they're treating people with grief. And so maybe I'm a little bit over-immersed in it. But I feel like there are people, just lay people. I have a friend that's a teacher, and her mother died suddenly. She created a grief journal for young people to use, younger people to use. And she doesn't have any training except for the fact that she had a significant loss.
Yeah.
So she's making meaning out of her own grief experience. And I see a lot of that kind of stuff, that people have just decided, this is what I needed. So here's what you could use.
Yeah. And I'm just going to make something real. Like I'm going to make something really
And so if there are, 100 different things out there, choose something that might be a good fit for you. I was having a conversation the other day with a friend about this whole grief judgment thing that we have now, where we tell everybody, these are the horrible things that everybody keeps saying that you shouldn't say. Here's the deal. There is nothing you can say to someone who is grieving that's going to fit every person's grief style. Yeah. You're going to offend or hurt somebody. And the other thing is, you can't make it worse. They've already had the loss.
Yeah. And it's like better to try.
Yeah. So if the best thing you can come up with is, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Yeah.
There you go.
And you're not going to remind them of it because they're thinking about it 100% of the time. So it's not like, ooh, should I say something? What if I make her cry? It's just like, it's right there.
Yeah, what if I remind her
Yeah,
that her husband
she
just
knows.
died? I'm thinking she still remembers. Yes. Yeah, so I do think that there is a building positive conversation about acknowledging who we are
Yeah.
as humans and as grievers, and asking better of ourselves,
Yeah.
I think, is what we're starting to say.
Totally. Yeah. And there's also like these really great listicles. Like, I feel like this question about like, are things changing? It's like, there's all these listicles of like how to help someone. And it's like, even just like super practical stuff, like let them know, like no pressure to respond, like there's a casserole on your doorstep.
Right. I'll just be here with
No
you.
pressure to respond. Yeah. Let me know if you want me to eat it with you or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just giving people space, and there's like real tips around now.
Yeah. And not space like you have your space over there because I don't want to be in your grief space because it makes me uncomfortable. But here's your grief space. I see it and I'm right on the edge of it. I'm going to stand up here. And whenever you want to let me into that, we can do that together.
Right. And I'm also like not going to make it about me. And I'm not going to make me feel better about how I'm helping.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation. And I really like the direction it's going.
Totally. Same. Yeah. It's the right direction. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels right to me as an end of life worker. But so when it comes to end of life and suffering and grief, what's on your wish list as a physician, right? What's on your wish list for healthcare in the U.S.?
Yeah. I mean, like thinking about end of life care, I mean, people talk about like death with dignity, right? Like death with dignity for everybody, whatever that means to them. And I think that is real. Like, I think like the American healthcare system often is not creating that for people. The cultural, technological, like nature of the health system doesn't always lend itself to peace or communication or, anything necessarily like that. Although it can, and like palliative care and hospice do, and that's all changing as well in a really beautiful way. And then like similarly, there's this woman who's a palliative care physician named Sunitha Puri who wrote this. She wrote a memoir as well, but she wrote this New York Times article called Unequal Lives, Unequal Deaths. And that's also about, this is true around the world, right? Where if people don't have access to like a safe place even to be sick or pain medications, period, like that kind of thing, like making it so everybody has access to reduce unnecessary suffering. And then, and then I think probably this just like what we were just saying about a bigger cultural conversation that can help everybody like have words and be seen and, like help us see this end of life and dying as like, not as this other side event that we were like hoping wasn't going to happen, but like a real part of our lives. And, until you die, you're alive and you're a person.
Isn't that the key to the whole thing?
Totally.
I love it. I love it. Lucy, how can listeners connect with you?
I'm kind of on like Twitter or whatever it's called now. I'm not going to say it. I dropped off a little bit for my mental health, but I'm there. My handle is Rocket Girl MD. And I also made a podcast during the pandemic called Gravity. And it's about like narratives of suffering. It's a little more fun and interesting than that sounds. And I'm tied up a bit in my sister's like online magazine, which is called Cup of Joe. Those are the main ways. You can DM me on Twitter.
Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for what you do.
Wonderful. I was just thrilled to have you on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure.
You can connect with Lucy at lucykalanithi.com. I'll have a link in the show notes if you're not sure how to spell it. The book, is available all over the place. When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. It's an amazing book. If you work in end-of-life care, I would really recommend that you get this book. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.